We are talking about a civilization so arrogant, so blindingly wealthy, that they truly believed the fundamental laws of physics and finance simply did not apply to them. While Paris starved, drowning in hopelessness and rain-soaked squalor, 12 miles away, the king and queen lived in an architectural fever dream, consuming the national budget like it was free water. Imagine Versailles. It wasn't just a palace. It was a cosmic insult to God and man. Every wall was gilded, every mirror reflected unimaginable opulence, built by the sweat and pain of generations of French citizens who were now literally eating mud and sawdust to survive the winter. And at the heart of this gilded tragedy stood Marie Antoinette, the Austrian, the absolute symbol of everything the French people despised: foreign intervention, catastrophic debt, and a detachment from reality so severe it reads like a cruel joke in the history books. She wasn't just disliked. She was a mythological figure of excess, a woman whose hairstyles required structural scaffolding and whose personal wardrobe budget could feed an entire province for a year. Rumors, true or not, spread like wildfire. Every gown, every diamond necklace, every extravagant opera was another nail hammered deep into the coffin of the Bourbon monarchy. The reality was simple and terrifying. France was utterly and profoundly broken. Not politically yet, but financially. They had poured untold millions into supporting the American rebels, a glorious yet bankrupting endeavor driven purely by spite for the British. The national coffers were bone dry, drained completely by decades of catastrophic war, relentless royal extravagance, and an archaic, utterly useless tax system that placed the entire burden squarely and ruthlessly on the backs of the poorest people. Think about the sheer absurdity of the Ancien regime. Society was divided into 3 rigid, impenetrable layers, 3 estates that refused to acknowledge the reality of the nation's survival. The first estate, the clergy, owned massive tracts of land, held incredible wealth that reached into every corner of the realm and paid virtually no tax at all. Their contribution was simply to pray. The second estate, the nobility, controlled the government, the military, the courts, and every lever of power. They lived off ancient privilege and were also exempt from almost all forms of meaningful taxation. Their contribution was simply to exist. And then there was the third estate. 97% of the entire population. Everyone else, the doctors, the lawyers, the bakers, the farmers, the street sweepers, the laborers, the people who actually built and fed and ran France. They paid the crushing, brutal taxes. They paid the hefty tithes to the church. They paid the arbitrary feudal dues to the nobility. They were the essential engine of the nation, chained and starved, forced to carry the weight of the 2 massive parasitic classes above them. The fuse was lit not by philosophers, but by nature itself. 3 devastating years of abysmal harvests. The price of bread, the absolute staple of the French diet, the only thing keeping millions alive, skyrocketed until a single loaf cost a full entire month's wage for an average worker in Paris. When the people can no longer afford the food necessary to live, when they see their children wasting away in the gutter while the king holds another masked ball, the social contract doesn't just fray, It snaps like a dry twig under immense pressure. Louis XVI, bless his clueless, well-meaning heart, tried desperately to fix it. He appointed brilliant financial ministers like Jacques Necker, men who understood perfectly that you cannot simply spend what you do not have indefinitely. The court of Versailles was a viper's nest of entrenched self-interest. They would rather see the entire kingdom burn to ashes than give up 1 ounce of their inherited, tax-free, ancient luxury. They pushed back. They whispered poison into the king's easily manipulated ear, and Necker was repeatedly and humiliatingly fired. This wasn't just an economic failure. It was a profound moral and spiritual collapse of the entire ruling class. They had lost the right to rule long before the people decided, violently, to take it from them forever. A catastrophe no one saw coming, because they thought they could absolutely control it. The king thought he was just raising a few new taxes. What he was actually doing was handing a lit match to a starving mob and inviting them personally into the powder keg of French politics. The very act of calling the Estates General gave the disenfranchised Third Estate a voice, a chance to formalize their grievances and articulate the deep, festering wounds of the nation in public forum. They poured their suffering, their anger, and their demands onto paper in thousands of notebooks called the Cahiers de Doléances, grievances demanding justice, equality, and above all else, bread. The whispers of revolution were now loud enough to rattle the enormous crystal chandeliers in Versailles. The stage was set for May 1789. The deputies arrived, dressed uniformly in plain, humble black, the uniform of the subservient, to meet the gilded, arrogant First and Second Estates. But they didn't come to beg, they came to demand. And the moment the Third Estate realized they were still going to be treated like subordinates, their voices counted as nothing, the revolution officially left the drawing room and spilled irreversible blood into the streets. The Third Estate, this massive, boiling ocean of 97% of France, suddenly found the door slammed shut in their faces. Versailles, that golden cage of arrogance, had locked them out of the meeting hall, literally trying to silence the voice of a nation. But these men, lawyers, merchants, and thinkers, men like Abbé Sieyès and Mirabeau, were not going to simply pack their bags and go home to be hanged as traitors. They marched with white-hot determination across the manicured grounds of Versailles, searching for a place, any place, where they could convene and finalize their unthinkable declaration. They found it, a cavernous, dusty, indoor tennis court, smelling of sweat and wood rot, but to them, it was suddenly the sacred altar of liberty. There, standing shoulder to shoulder, under the fierce gaze of the rising sun of rebellion, they swore the legendary tennis court oath. They vowed, in a chilling echo that still reverberates through history, that they would not separate until they had given France a written constitution, a binding covenant that stripped the king of his absolute, God-given power. The revolution had found its body and named itself the National Assembly. When news of this unprecedented defiance reached Louis XVI, sitting comfortably in his gilded cage, he responded with the political equivalent of pouring gasoline on a bonfire. He did not negotiate, he did not listen, he merely ordered the immediate deployment of 20,000 royal troops, mostly ruthless German and Swiss mercenaries, to encircle Paris. This was not an attempt at peace. This was a declaration of war against his own capital city. Simultaneously, he committed the fatal blunder of firing Jacques Necker, his wildly popular finance minister, the one man the populace trusted to sort out the financial disaster. For the Parisians, already starving, terrified, and boiling over with resentment, this was the ultimate confirmation. The king was plotting to dissolve the assembly by force, starve the city into submission, and bathe the streets in the blood of patriots. A single spark was all it took for the entire powder keg to detonate into utter chaos, and that spark arrived in the form of a young, electrifying journalist. The city erupted, mobs swarmed the streets, their hunger transforming into terrifying, focused rage. They broke into the Invalides, the massive military hospital, seizing 40,000 muskets, but they lacked the crucial ingredient, gunpowder. Where did the king store the massive reserves of powder needed to supply an army? In the ominous, impenetrable fortress that loomed over the city, a prison that symbolized everything hateful and arbitrary about Bourbon rule, the Bastille. This ancient structure, with its 8 colossal towers and terrifying reputation, was not just a prison. It was the physical embodiment of the king's right to imprison anyone, anytime, for any reason, with no appeal. It held only 7 pathetic prisoners at the time, 4 for forgery and 3 who were utterly insane, but its symbolic value was priceless. On July 14, 1789, a desperate crowd, swollen to thousands, converged on the Bastille. They were not an army. They were a tidal wave of desperate humanity, armed with axes, kitchen knives, and stolen muskets, demanding gunpowder and the head of the governor, Bernard René Delaunay. Delaunay, a man tragically overconfident in his stone walls, tried to negotiate, promising peace, but the crowd surged forward, smashing the drawbridges down with unbelievable force. The battle was short, brutal, and drenched in immediate, visceral savagery. That night, when the Duc de la Rochefoucauld-Liancourt woke Louis XVI to tell him the Bastille had fallen, the king famously asked, "Is it a revolt?" The Duke responded with the line that defined the end of the Age of Kings, "No, sire, it is a revolution." But the violence was already a virus, spreading far beyond the city limits. Across the French countryside, peasants, long oppressed by the centuries-old feudal system, heard the news of the Bastille and believed the time had come for their own reckoning. This period became known chillingly as the Grande Peur, the Great Fear. Rumors flew that aristocrats were hiring brigands to burn crops and starve the people, a panic manufactured by the very desperation of hunger. In response, the peasants rose up, attacking the chateaux, destroying the manorial registers, the crucial legal documents that bound them to pay rents and labor obligations, thus obliterating the historical chain of servitude with fire and rage. They hunted down tax collectors and seigneurs, demanding an end to the ancient regime, often subjecting those who resisted to the same grisly fate as Delaunay. The fear that had gripped the Third Estate for generations was now returned tenfold upon the heads of the nobility. Faced with the total, catastrophic collapse of order, the National Assembly knew they had to act, and they acted with speed and revolutionary ruthlessness. On the night of August 4, 1789, the Assembly met, and in a fit of rhetorical frenzy and terrified self-preservation, they tore the fabric of French society to shreds. In a matter of hours, they passed a series of unprecedented decrees, officially abolishing feudalism, the tithe, the church tax, the hunting rights of the nobles, the exclusive right to hold office, and all the historic regional privileges of cities and provinces. The entire social order that had defined France for 1,000 years was dismantled in a single terrifying summer night, forever changing the meaning of being French. The first phase of the revolution was complete. The people had destroyed the king's authority and annihilated the pillars of aristocratic power. But they still had to decide what to put in its place, and that decision would unleash a conflict far bloodier than anyone could have imagined. The absolute abolition of feudalism, the Great Fear, and the destruction of the old regime had created a terrifying vacuum. The National Assembly, having successfully torn down the pillars of the monarchy and aristocracy, now faced the monumental and impossible task of building a new nation from the smoking rubble. They needed more than laws. They needed a creed, a philosophical statement of purpose that would justify the immense upheaval and serve as the foundation for the new French Constitution. This required nothing less than rewriting the rules of human existence itself, aiming a philosophical canon directly at every crowned head in Europe. What emerged was the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, unveiled in August 1789, a document so radical and intoxicating that it instantly became the revolutionary scripture. It declared that all men are born and remain free and equal in rights, dismantling centuries of inherited privilege and divine decree with a single elegant stroke of the pen. Sovereignty resided not in the king but in the nation itself, meaning the entire body of the people, and the law was merely the expression of the general will. Liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression were proclaimed as natural and imprescriptible rights, those that could not, under any circumstance, be taken away. This document was the ideological engine of the revolution, giving the popular rage intellectual weight and moral justification. Yet, while the deputies debated these lofty, earth-shaking principles inside the legislative hall, the reality outside was turning brutal, cold, and desperately hungry. The philosophical revolution was complete, but the stomach revolution was far from over. As the assembly morphed into the National Constituent Assembly, charged with writing the full Constitution, it immediately fractured into warring ideological camps, marking the true beginning of parliamentary politics. On the right sat the monarchians, the moderates who still clung to the idea of a stable English-style constitutional monarchy, complete with a strong upper house and significant power for the king. They argued that stability required an anchor, and Louis XVI, stripped of his divine right but still respected, could be that figurehead. But the left, the radicals, feared nothing more than a royal comeback, believing the king would use any residual power to betray the people. They demanded a unicameral legislature, a single, powerful chamber immediately responsive to the people's will. And, most critically, they battled over the royal veto, the king's power to block legislation. Should the king have an absolute veto, allowing him to neutralize revolutionary laws? Or should it be a suspensive veto, merely delaying enforcement? This was not just a technical debate, it was a symbolic war for the soul of the revolution. If Louis could indefinitely halt their laws, the Declaration and the August decrees were worthless pieces of paper. The fear was utterly paralyzing. The king, still ensconced in the opulent isolation of Versailles, refused to formally endorse either the abolition of feudalism or the Declaration of Rights. This royal resistance coincided disastrously with the deepening economic catastrophe gripping Paris. The harvests had failed again, and the bread shortage was now chronic, turning the streets into a cauldron of starvation and resentment. The average Parisian laborer was spending almost 4/5 of his daily wage just to buy enough flour for his family to survive. Rumors, faster and deadlier than any plague, swept through the markets. Whispers of counter-revolutionary plots being hatched at Versailles, of grain hoarded by aristocrats, and of the king preparing to flee Paris with his foreign queen, Marie Antoinette, the hated symbol of Austrian excess. The ultimate spark came when news reached the capital of a lavish military banquet held at Versailles for the newly arrived Flanders Regiment. In a drunken display of loyalty, King's bodyguards reportedly threw the revolutionary tricolor cockade to the ground, replacing it with the pure white symbol of the Bourbon dynasty. This was more than an insult. It was treason in the eyes of the starving masses. They saw it as proof that the king was celebrating their misery and preparing military action against the capital. On October 5, 1789, the revolution mobilized its most formidable and terrifying force, the women of the Parisian markets. Thousands of them, the formidable fishwives, or poissards, known for their iron will and blunt brutality, armed themselves with whatever they could find: pikes, muskets, axes, and kitchen knives. Driven by primal hunger and righteous fury, they began the 12-mile march in the pouring, relentless rain toward the gilded sanctuary of Versailles. These were not intellectual revolutionaries. They were desperate mothers and workers demanding one thing: bread. They were followed reluctantly by the Marquis de Lafayette, leader of the National Guard, who knew that if he did not control the mob, the monarchy would be annihilated entirely. When the women arrived, drenched, exhausted, and absolutely enraged, they swarmed the palace gates like an unstoppable tide. The mob stormed through the Hall of Mirrors, desperately searching for the Austrian queen, Marie Antoinette, the woman they truly blamed for emptying the nation's treasury. She barely escaped the onslaught, fleeing barefoot through secret passages to the king's apartments. Louis, pale and terrified, stood before the howling masses. He was forced to utter the words that sealed the fate of his ancestral home and his own freedom. "My friends, I will go to Paris with my wife and my children." The king was now a prisoner of Paris, trapped in the eye of the storm, under the perpetual, watchful, and unforgiving glare of the radical Parisian masses. The constitutional showdown was about to begin, but now it would take place under impossible pressure. The Grand Curtain rose on May 5, 1789. Not in a quiet chamber, but in the sprawling, gilded halls of Versailles, a setting of such incomprehensible wealth that it was itself an insult to the starving masses. Every single detail of the opening ceremony of the Estates General was a weapon designed to reinforce the ancient, suffocating hierarchy of France. The First Estate, the clergy, arrived cloaked in purple and gold, shimmering figures of divine authority. The Second Estate, the nobility, were magnificent, dripping in velvet, lace, and the ancestral steel of their swords, symbols of their right to rule and their freedom from taxation. But then came the Third Estate, the 97% of the French nation, forced to wear the drab, humiliating black uniform prescribed by the court, herded like sheep into the back of the hall. This wasn't a meeting. It was a public display of subjugation and contempt that burned itself into the minds of every lawyer, merchant, and doctor who represented the people. Louis XVI, surrounded by the ghosts of his powerful ancestors, delivered a speech that was astonishing in its mediocrity. It was rambling, uninspired, and focused entirely on the crushing debt, treating the fundamental crisis as merely a bookkeeping error, not an existential threat to the crown. The core problem immediately surfaced, a ticking time bomb deliberately planted by centuries of privilege. How would they vote? The ancient tradition demanded voting by order, one vote for the clergy, one for the nobility, and one for the third estate. This guaranteed that the two privileged orders, who always voted together to protect their exemptions, would veto any reform 2-1, neutralizing the power of the people before the session even began. The Third Estate demanded voting by head, allowing their 600 delegates to potentially outvote the combined 600 delegates of the other two warders if enough liberal nobles or sympathetic parish priests crossed the floor. For 5 agonizing weeks, the entire mechanism of French governance ground to a terrifying halt. The air in Versailles was thick with passive aggression and simmering rage. The privileged orders refused to budge. They simply refused to join the Third Estate for joint sessions, treating them as constitutional infants. But the delegates of the Third Estate were not cowards. They were educated, radicalized, and armed with the explosive ideas of the Enlightenment. They realized that waiting for the king or the nobles was suicidal. They had to act alone. The revolutionary pivot came on June 17, driven by the radical constitutional theorist Abbé Sieyès, whose pamphlet, What is the Third Estate?, had already set Paris ablaze with its simple, shattering conclusion: the Third Estate is the nation. By a vote of 490 to 90, the delegates of the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly, the sole, legitimate representative body of the French people. This was not a reform. It was a coup d'état by declaration, tearing sovereignty away from the king and placing it directly into the hands of the nation itself. Louis XVI, manipulated by the hardline royalists led by the Queen and his brother, the Comte d'Artois, finally decided to intervene with a display of royal authority, a move that proved to be one of the most catastrophic blunders in monarchical history. On the morning of June 20, the delegates arrived at their meeting hall, the Salle des États, only to find the doors locked, guarded by soldiers, and a crude sign declaring that the king needed the room for a royal session cleanup. The intent was clear: to humiliate, disperse, and silence the newly formed National Assembly before it could meet again. But the delegates, instead of scattering, marched across the streets of Versailles in a furious, defiant procession. They found an open, dusty, indoor tennis court nearby, the Jeu de Paume, and flooded into its echoing space. It was here, in a room built for leisure, that the true revolution was born. Standing on makeshift benches, led by the astronomer and revolutionary Bailly, they swore an oath that rings through history: the Serment du Jeu de Paume, the tennis court oath. They solemnly swore never to separate and to reassemble wherever circumstances require, until the constitution of the kingdom is established and consolidated upon solid foundations. This was not just disobedience. This was a vow of permanent, non-violent resistance, claiming absolute political authority independent of the king's will. They had moved beyond asking for change. They were demanding and creating it themselves. 3 days later, the king convened the royal session, intending to crush the assembly and dictate reforms from on high. Louis, pale and visibly nervous, declared the assembly's recent actions null and void, ordering the delegates of the Third Estate to retire and resume their old, subordinate positions. The nobility and the loyalists obeyed and marched out, but the delegates of the National Assembly remained frozen in their seats, a silent, unified block of defiance in the vast, emptying hall. When the master of ceremonies, the Marquis de Dreux-Brazé, repeated the king's command to disperse, the immense figure of the Comte de Mirabeau, the noble orator who had defected to the Third Estate, rose to his feet. His voice, a resonant thunder that shook the rafters of the hall, delivered the ultimate challenge to the divine right monarchy. Go tell your master that we are here by the will of the people, and we shall not leave except by the force of bayonets. The king, weak, confused, and fundamentally unwilling to shed the blood of his own subjects, mumbled his ultimate, pathetic defeat. Oh well, let them stay. By June 27, realizing the futility of confrontation and fearing the explosive reaction of Paris, Louis capitulated entirely. He formally ordered the clergy and the nobility to join the National Assembly. The revolution, once a constitutional theory, was now a legal, recognized reality, operating under the terrifying, exhilarating knowledge that the sovereign power of France now resided not in Versailles, but in the people and their assembly, preparing for the storm that was about to break wide open. The National Assembly had defied the crown, signing their Declaration of Independence not with ink, but with the searing heat of sheer, unprecedented courage. But defiance demands a response, and Louis XVI, fueled by the poisonous pride of his court and the whispering rage of his Austrian queen, finally stirred from his lethargy, ready to deliver the fatal blow he believed would restore Bourbon dignity. He locked the doors of the assembly hall, intending to hold a royal session where he would unilaterally annul every single one of their revolutionary decrees. "Go tell your master," Mirabeau roared, his voice shaking the chandeliers, "that we are here by the will of the people, and we will not leave except by the force of bayonets." It was a declaration of war, a direct, unfiltered rejection of 800 years of divine right. The king, faced with open, organized resistance, hesitated. His indecision was the death warrant of his reign. He lacked the iron will to unleash the immediate massacre required to suppress the assembly, and so the assembly stood. This victory, purchased by Mirabeau's defiance, momentarily unified the three estates as royal authority crumbled into dust. But Louis XVI was not defeated. He was merely cornered. He began secretly surrounding Paris with loyal foreign troops, Swiss mercenaries, German regiments, men who had no shared history or sympathy with the starved, seething citizens of the capital. Rumors flooded the streets. The king was preparing a coup, a military purge to eliminate the patriots and restore the old tyranny. The price of bread, the ultimate barometer of revolutionary tension, skyrocketed to impossible heights. A single loaf could cost a worker a full day's wage, turning the anxiety of political upheaval into the stark reality of physical starvation. Paris became a seething cauldron of paranoia and hunger, waiting for the spark that would ignite the city into a firestorm of unimaginable violence. The spark arrived on July 11th, delivered by the fatally arrogant hands of the king's inner circle. Louis XVI, urged by his reactionary brothers and Queen Marie Antoinette, dismissed Jacques Necker, the popular finance minister and the last symbol of royal commitment to reform. Necker, despite his flaws, was seen as the people's champion, the only man standing between them and total aristocratic vengeance. His sudden, secret removal was interpreted instantly, not as a political maneuver, but as the declaration of a royalist massacre. Within hours, the streets erupted. The people adopted green ribbons. The color démoulin impulsively chose as the sign of the rebellion, which quickly evolved into the red, white, and blue cockade. The search for weapons became a desperate, primal need. The mob, now organizing into a furious, unstoppable militia, first targeted the Hôtel des Invalides, a vast military hospital and depot on the left bank. On the morning of July 14th, the citizens stormed the Invalides, overpowering the meager guards and seizing approximately 30,000 muskets, a colossal arsenal ready to arm the revolution. But they had the guns, and they had the men, yet they lacked the vital ingredient, gunpowder. And the largest known store of gunpowder, along with the intimidating presence of cannon, was held within the stone walls of the most reviled, most symbolic fortress of royal tyranny. The target was inescapable: the Bastille, a monstrous medieval prison on the eastern edge of the city. Its massive towers represented the arbitrary cruelty of the Bourbon monarchs, a place where citizens could vanish forever without trial or trace. It was a physical manifestation of the absolute power the people had sworn to abolish. That morning, only 7 prisoners languished inside its dark cells, a handful of common criminals and lunatics, but the symbol was all that mattered. The true prize was the enormous cache of powder and shot stored in its dungeons, vital fuel for the 30,000 muskets they had just plundered. The governor of the Bastille, Bernard-René de Launay, a man trapped by his loyalty and his geography, commanded a mere 110 soldiers, mostly elderly veterans and a handful of Swiss guards, staring out at an ocean of enraged, armed citizens demanding entry. They demanded powder. They demanded justice. De Launay refused. Negotiations broke down in a chaos of misunderstanding and terror. Then, a few shots rang out. Whether accidental or intentional, history cannot agree, but the sound was the trigger. The desperate siege began. The air was thick with smoke, the cries of the mob, and the deafening roar of cannons brought from the Invalides, now trained upon the Bastille's imposing walls. The siege was a bloody, frantic mess, a street fight fueled by starvation and paranoia, but it carried the weight of destiny. Louis XVI, far away at Versailles, was woken in the night by the Duc de la Rochefoucauld, who informed him of the uprising. "Is it a revolt?" the king famously asked, still unable to grasp the magnitude of the event. "No, sire," the Duke replied, his voice heavy with the terrible truth. "It is a revolution." The power was officially, violently, and irrevocably transferred from the king's crown to the bloody pikes of the Parisian populace. The storm was no longer approaching. It had consumed the entire kingdom, demanding a sacrificial cleansing that would spare no one, not even the anointed King of France. The First and Second Estates, the clergy and the nobility, knew this spelled the end of their privilege, and they refused, clinging to the rotting corpse of the old world with manic intensity. Day after agonizing day, the deadlock persisted, the air thick with aristocratic contempt and revolutionary fervor that only intensified the summer heat within the chambers. The Third Estate finally understood the game. They weren't there to advise the king. They were there to be France. On June 17, 1789, in a move that echoed through the halls of history like a thunderclap, they seized the mantle of sovereignty. They declared themselves the National Assembly, the true voice of the nation, effectively erasing the divine right of the king with a simple yet terrifying parliamentary vote. This audacious move transformed a tax meeting into a political revolution overnight. Louis XVI, paralyzed by indecision and surrounded by reactionary courtiers, chief among them his brother, the Comte d'Artois, who whispered poison in his ear, reacted with pathetic clumsiness, attempting to assert his waning authority. He tried to halt the inevitable. He ordered the doors of the Assembly Hall, the Salle des Menus Plaisirs, locked and barred, claiming the chamber needed urgent repairs, a transparent lie that only fueled the inferno of suspicion and revolutionary determination among the delegates. But when the doors of their assigned meeting place were sealed shut by royal guard, the deputies of the National Assembly did not disperse like frightened mice. They marched, resolute and determined, their collective will hardening into steel. They found a nearby dust-covered indoor tennis court, the Jeu de Paume, a strange, echoing location for the birth of a republic founded on modern ideals. This was not merely a promise. It was a sacred, irrevocable covenant forged in defiance. It was the moment the crown realized it no longer held the monopoly on power. The nation had claimed it back, and no amount of royal decree could rewind the clock. For 3 days the king stalled, a figure of tragic impotence, oscillating wildly between calls for military suppression and pathetic conciliation. Finally, on June 23, Louis made his declaration, condescendingly ordering the 3 estates to return to their separate, powerless chambers, attempting to nullify the revolutionary events of the preceding week. The response was delivered by the towering, formidable figure of the Comte de Mirabeau, a notorious nobleman who had defected to the Third Estate, his voice booming with revolutionary authority and contempt for royal weakness. Louis, facing this unprecedented, theatrical defiance, and realizing the troops guarding the hall might actually side with the assembly rather than fire upon their countrymen, backed down in stunned silence. He instructed the remaining members of the First and Second Estates to join the National Assembly, seemingly conceding defeat. It seemed, for a brief, blinding moment in late June 1789, that the revolution had won a glorious, bloodless victory through sheer force of political will. But this was merely a deceptive, tactical retreat engineered by a desperate monarch. Louis XVI, spurred on by the bitter humiliation of Marie Antoinette and the hyper-reactionary clique that dominated Versailles, never intended to share power with mere commoners. While he publicly accepted the assembly, secretly, he was pulling the levers of war, preparing the stage for a catastrophic military confrontation. Orders were dispatched across the kingdom to bring loyal regiments to Paris, Swiss guards, German mercenaries, men whose loyalty was bought with foreign gold, not born of French soil or revolutionary ideals. By early July, 20,000 cold-eyed soldiers were encircling Paris and Versailles, their presence a palpable threat hanging over the city like a freshly sharpened guillotine blade ready to drop on the necks of the patriots. The Parisian populace watched these calculated troop movements with rising dread, knowing full well what the deployment meant. The king was preparing for the coup de force, a brutal military crackdown designed to dissolve the National Assembly, arrest its leaders, and return France to the crushing medieval chains of absolute Bourbon monarchy forever. The people's last political hope rested on one man, Jacques Necker, the popular finance minister who, despite his fundamental policy failings, was seen as the only fragile link between the monarchy and the masses. When news of Necker's dismissal reached the volatile city of Paris the very next morning, it detonated the social powder keg. It was instantly and universally interpreted not as a routine cabinet shuffle, but as the final, irrevocable declaration of war by the crown against the entire French nation. The gates of the Tuileries Palace were violently stormed by frantic, enraged crowds, and the young, radical journalist Camille Desmoulins stood upon a café table outside the Palais Royal, dramatically brandishing a pistol in the air for all to see. "To arms, citizens!" he shrieked, his voice raw with revolutionary emotion and fear. Necker is dismissed. This is the signal for a St. Bartholomew's massacre of the patriots. We must defend ourselves now. The desperate cry was taken up instantly and echoed through the winding streets of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. Paris erupted into a frenzy of revolutionary paranoia and preparation for the inevitable street war. The people desperately needed weapons to defend themselves against the looming military threat of Louis's 20,000 mercenaries. They needed a symbol of resistance, something tangible to rally behind, something terrible to strike at the heart of royal oppression and millennia of injustice. They needed the guns, the cannons, and the powder to fight the coming war, and they knew exactly where to find them, locked away behind the formidable stone walls of the ancient medieval fortress that stood like a sneering, brutal monument to Bourbon tyranny, casting its dark, oppressive shadow over the eastern quartiers, the terrifying Bastille. The Assembly, now the self-proclaimed National Constituent Assembly, immediately capitalized on this seismic shift. They needed to legitimize the armed citizens who had just overthrown a symbol of the state. Suddenly, the chaotic Parisian militia was formalized into the National Guard, a force of revolutionary order placed under the command of the Marquis de Lafayette, the dashing hero of the American War of Independence. Lafayette, the man who dreamed of dual republics, was now holding the reins of armed Parisian power, an incredible concentration of revolutionary military might. The euphoria of Paris was matched only by the terrifying, infectious fear sweeping across the flat, fertile plains of France. This was the birth of La Grande Peur, the Great Fear, an agrarian plague of paranoia that gripped the soul of the nation's interior. Peasants, already crushed by feudal dues and believing that brigands, or worse, the vengeful aristocratic armies, were coming to burn their crops and steal their last meager stores, snapped. They did not wait for official orders from Paris. They took justice into their own calloused, starving hands. What followed was a terrifying summer of reckoning, a localized apocalypse fueled by centuries of repressed agrarian fury. Manor houses, the chateau that represented the iron fist of the feudal system, went up in smoke across the landscape like angry bonfires, illuminating the night sky with the funeral pyres of the Ancien Régime. The primary target was not the nobles themselves, though violence was common, but the terriers, the ancient, legally binding documents that listed all the feudal obligations, the rents, the fees, and the brutal labor owed to the local lord. They didn't just burn the ledgers, they often terrorized the local aristocrats, forcing them to renounce their ancient rights at the point of a pitchfork or a scythe. Many nobles, seeing the literal flames approaching their estates, realized that the time for polite debate and quiet patronage was definitively over. They began a desperate, panicked flight across the borders, the hated émigrés, taking their money, their jewels, and their simmering desire for bloody, foreign-backed vengeance with them. This aristocratic exodus would prove to be a fatal long-term error, abandoning the king when he needed domestic support the most. The National Constituent Assembly, meeting in the shadow of this widespread agrarian terror, knew they had a moment of pure, terrifying leverage, a chance to stabilize the nation by satisfying the deepest cries of the populace. In the feverish, chaotic night of August 4, 1789, they staged one of the most astonishing legislative sessions in European history. It was a moment of grand, dramatic, voluntary self-destruction by the nobility present, an unprecedented wave of self-sacrifice driven by political calculus and sheer terror. Driven by a mix of genuine liberal sentiment and the overwhelming threat of total anarchy, one noble after another rose to renounce their centuries-old privileges. The Duc d'Aiguillon, one of the wealthiest men in France, stood up to declare the immediate end of feudalism. Tithes, hunting rights, manorial courts, tax exemptions, the sale of offices, the entire suffocating, archaic scaffolding of the Ancien Régime was dismantled in a single frenetic 12-hour session of legislative adrenaline. They called them the August Decrees. Overnight, France was legally remade, transforming from a medieval relic into a legally modern state. The concept of a hierarchy based on birth, which had been the foundation of society since Charlemagne, was pulverized. This was the true legal end of feudalism. Yet the devil, as always, was hidden deep in the clauses. While personal serfdom was abolished immediately and unconditionally, financial dues tied to land required monetary compensation, a loophole that would quickly infuriate the very peasants they sought to appease and fuel suspicion against the bourgeois lawyers who drafted the fine print. With the old structure destroyed, the assembly turned to defining the soul of the new nation. They crafted a document that would echo across the globe for centuries, a philosophical battering ram against all forms of inherited tyranny, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Influenced heavily by Enlightenment ideals, particularly Rousseau and the American Declaration of Independence, this document proclaimed in soaring, universal language that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression were declared natural and imprescriptible rights. It was a blueprint for a liberal democratic state, ensuring freedom of speech and religion and establishing the revolutionary principle that sovereignty resides not in the king but in the nation itself. But here was the fundamental, catastrophic problem that guaranteed further bloodshed. Louis XVI, still technically the King of France, had to assent to this radical new framework, the August decrees and the Declaration, which effectively turned him from an absolute monarch chosen by divine decree into a constitutional figurehead chosen by the nation. Predictably, from the physical and emotional safety of Versailles, he refused to sign. He stalled. He prevaricated, seeking counsel from conservative advisors and hoping the Parisian fever would simply break. The tension was a coiled spring, ready to launch the city at the throat of the aristocracy. The final, explosive spark came when rumors reached Paris that royal troops stationed at Versailles had trampled the revolutionary cockade, the sacred red, white, and blue symbol, during a lavish, drunken banquet, an act of intentional, arrogant provocation that suggested the king was planning a military crackdown to dissolve the assembly by force. The starving citizens of Paris, particularly the market women, the fierce and unforgiving poissards, saw this as the ultimate insult. They were hungry, they were enraged, and they had just learned that their king was actively conspiring against them while literally feasting in luxury miles away. The path was clear. They would not wait for the king to come to the people would go to the king. And they would march on Versailles, dragging the monarchy back to the capital city, ending centuries of Bourbon isolation and placing the entire royal family under the direct, chilling supervision of the Parisian mob. The silence of Versailles was replaced by the terrifying roar of Paris. Louis XVI, once the Sun King's heir, was now nothing more than a magnificent captive locked inside the Tuileries palace, staring out at the menacing crowds that gathered daily, demanding not just bread, but ultimate accountability. Every move he made, every whisper in the royal chambers was filtered through the anxious ears of the National Guard, commanded by the revolutionary hero Lafayette. His gilded cage was a symbol of the monarchy's utter failure, a monument to the fact that power had fundamentally, irrevocably shifted from the divine right of kings to the fickle, bloodthirsty will of the people. The Tuileries was not just a residence, it was a psychological battlefield where the weight of centuries of Bourbon pride was slowly crushed under the boot of popular sovereignty. While the king paced his prison, the National Constituent Assembly, now comfortably established in Paris, was busy committing institutional murder against the old regime. They were not just reforming France, they were erasing it, systematically dismantling every piece of the feudal scaffolding that had supported the Bourbon dynasty since time immemorial. They abolished all hereditary titles, canceling centuries of aristocratic privilege with the stroke of a pen. Suddenly, the ancient dukes and counts were nothing more than citizen this or citizen that, a profound, gut-wrenching humiliation that drove tens of thousands of nobles fleeing across the borders, becoming the dreaded émigrés. They tore down the complex, unjust medieval tax system, replacing the oppressive salt tax, gabelle, and the feudal obligations that had crushed the peasantry for generations. But the most radical and perhaps most tragic necessity was money. The French state was still utterly bankrupt, drowning in debt inherited from funding the American Revolution and the extravagant life at Versailles. The revolutionary answer was swift, ruthless, and terrifying to the pious. The church owned approximately 10% of all French land, vast wealth accumulated over 1,000 years. The Assembly declared these lands national property, a breathtaking seizure that instantly made the state the largest property owner in France. To monetize this sudden, colossal wealth, they issued assignats, paper money backed by the value of the confiscated church estates. This was meant to stabilize the economy, to prove the revolution could pay its bills. But it quickly became the revolutionary fiat money, destined for ruinous inflation and further chaos that would devastate the savings of the newly emerging middle class. The spiritual aspect of this seizure was formalized in the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, passed in July 1790, the true turning point that fractured the revolution into two irreconcilable camps. It reorganized the entire Catholic Church in France, effectively turning priests and bishops into state employees, paid by the Assembly and elected by the people. Even non-Catholics could vote for Catholic officials. This was an absolute outrage to the faithful, a direct, deliberate assault on the spiritual authority of the Pope in Rome. Every priest was required to take an oath of loyalty to the Constitution above the Church itself. Those who took the oath were the juring priests. Those who refused were the non-juring, refractory priests, who became instant counter-revolutionaries and martyrs in the eyes of the devout countryside. Louis XVI, a man paralyzed by deep personal piety, found signing this legislation agonizing. It felt like a betrayal of his soul, a guaranteed path to eternal damnation. This act, more than any political constraint, cemented his psychological opposition to the revolution, making his future flight an existential imperative. As the nation struggled to breathe under its new constitution, the real power was coalescing in the smoky, crowded halls of the political clubs. These were the engines of radicalization, where journalists, lawyers, and firebrands hammered out the ideological future of France. The most powerful, the most terrifying, was the Society of the Friends of the Constitution, better known simply as the Jacobin Club. Originally moderate, the Jacobins quickly became the epicenter of extreme revolutionary thought, spreading their network like a poisonous vine across the entire nation. Figures like Maximilien Robespierre, the austere, fiercely moral lawyer from Arras, began to sharpen his rhetorical blades within these very walls, perfecting the art of revolutionary purity and promising a terrifying moral rebirth for France. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, the great printing presses of Paris thundered relentlessly, spewing forth pamphlets and newspapers that grew more aggressive and violent with every passing dawn. Figures like Jean-Paul Marat, the infamous doctor of the people, used his publication L'Ami du Peuple, the friend of the people, to incite constant suspicion and paranoia, demanding immediate execution for anyone suspected of counter-revolutionary thought. Marat's words were pure poison, dissolving trust and promoting the idea that the revolution could only be saved through the constant bloody purge of its enemies. His inflammatory rhetoric was embraced as gospel by the Parisian working class, the sans-culottes, ensuring that the Assembly could never afford to be moderate. For a brief, intoxicating moment on the first anniversary of the storming of the Bastille, July 14, 1790, France pretended it was united. The Fête de la Fédération was held on the Champ de Mars, a massive national celebration designed to consecrate the new constitutional monarchy. 40,000 workers toiled day and night to build colossal earthworks and altars of liberty. These fleeing nobles, gathering in places like Koblenz, badgered the crowned heads of Europe, particularly the Holy Roman Emperor, Marie Antoinette's brother, to invade France and restore the monarchy, guaranteeing that the revolution would soon have to defend itself against the entire continent. The atmosphere was turning from hopeful zeal to absolute life-or-death paranoia. Every day that passed in the Tuileries was another layer of constraint placed upon the king, making the air thinner and the need for escape more immediate. The walls were closing in. The fatal moment of truth, the catastrophic dash for freedom, was now the only card Louis XVI had left to play. The air inside the Tuileries Palace was thick enough to choke on, laced with the metallic taste of fear and the desperate adrenaline of a final, impossible gamble. Every tick of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece was a hammer blow against the fragile plan orchestrated by the Swedish nobleman Axel von Fersen, the Queen's steadfast, maybe even romantic ally. They were not just running from Paris, they were attempting to rip the very heart of the French state out of the revolution's suffocating grip, aiming for the safety of the loyalist military camp at Montmedy, perilously close to the Austrian border. This was it, the moment the ancient monarchy decided to bet everything on a single, silent night train out of hell. A gamble so massive it threatened to plunge Europe into immediate, total war. The plan was audacious, relying entirely on absolute stealth and flawless execution, two qualities the Bourbon court had long forgotten how to command. The first fatal mistake was the king himself. Louis XVI was a man of routines, comfort, and considerable girth, wholly unsuited for the role of a fleeting fugitive. He insisted on bringing not only the royal children, but an entire entourage, including Madame de Tourzel, the governess, and a shocking amount of unnecessary luggage, gold plate, luxury linens, and court dresses. This necessitated the use of the infamous berline de voyage, a massive, lumbering, custom-built carriage designed less for speed and more for the sort of opulent comfort only monarchs demand. This vehicle was not a quick getaway car. It was a gilded, unmistakable fortress on wheels, heavy, slow, and impossible to mistake for anything other than an aristocratic flight. These initial, baffling delays proved instantly catastrophic. The critical cavalry escort, positioned strategically along the route to provide protection and fresh horses, waited until their preset deadline, growing nervous in the rising heat and suspicion of the early morning. When the royal carriage finally lumbered up to the first planned stop, the nervous escort, fearing exposure by the crowds already gathering to watch the strange activity, had already nervously disbanded and withdrawn, vanishing into the countryside.